The Age of Exploration. Level C. 1 Advance. Part 1. The Dawn of Discovery. It began with curiosity, a restless desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. The Age of Exploration, spanning roughly from the early 15th to the 17th century, was one of the most transformative periods in human history. During this era, sailors, scientists, and dreamers ventured into the unknown seas, connecting continents that had once seemed worlds apart. The result was both magnificent and devastating: a new global age of trade, knowledge, and power. The world before exploration. Before the 1400s, much of the world remained a mystery to Europeans. Maps were full of errors and blank spaces, often decorated with mythical creatures like sea serpents or dragons to fill the void of the unknown. While civilizations in Asia, Africa, and the Americas had long histories of travel and trade, Europeans were largely limited to the Mediterranean and nearby seas. The Silk Road, connecting Europe with China, had been the main link for centuries, but by the 15th century, it was becoming more dangerous and less profitable due to political instability and rising prices. In this climate, nations like Portugal and Spain began to search for alternative routes, paths that would bypass the Ottoman-controlled territories and open direct access to the riches of Asia. This desire for trade, gold, and spices became one of the main motivations behind exploration. The rise of maritime technology. One reason exploration became possible was the rapid progress in navigation and shipbuilding. The invention of the caravel, a light but strong sailing ship, allowed sailors to travel farther and faster than ever before. It could sail against the wind and handle long voyages on the open ocean. Instruments like the astrolabe and the magnetic compass gave explorers a new sense of direction, while advances in cartography helped them record and share their discoveries. It's fascinating to imagine how revolutionary these tools were at the time. For medieval sailors, who often relied on the stars and pure instinct, the ability to measure latitude or determine their position on a map must have felt almost magical. The sea was no longer an infinite void. It became a challenge to be mastered. Portugal takes the lead. Portugal was the first European country to invest heavily in exploration. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, a patron of science and discovery, the Portuguese established navigation schools and sponsored numerous voyages along the west coast of Africa. These expeditions had multiple goals: finding gold, spreading Christianity, and reaching India by sea. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias achieved what had once seemed impossible. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama followed the route and successfully reached India in 1498, opening a direct maritime link between Europe and Asia. This changed global trade forever. Spices, silk, and precious stones began to flow directly to European ports, enriching Portugal and setting off a wave of competition among rival powers. The Spanish challenge. Not wanting to be left behind, Spain soon entered the race for discovery. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, backed by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, set sail across the Atlantic in search of a westward route to Asia. Instead, he reached the Bahamas, unknowingly discovering the New World. Columbus believed he had arrived in the Indies, hence the term Indians, for the native peoples he encountered. But what he truly found was a vast and unknown continent that would soon transform the entire world. The Spanish crown quickly realized the potential of these new lands. Within decades, Spain established colonies across the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, extracting enormous wealth in gold and silver. This influx of riches turned Spain into a global superpower, though it also caused inflation and social problems back home. Competition, conquest, and consequence. As news of new lands and riches spread, other nations, England, France, and the Netherlands, joined the competition. The race for exploration soon turned into a race for colonization. This brought both progress and tragedy. While the world became more connected, indigenous civilizations were destroyed, enslaved, or forced to adapt to European dominance. By the early 16th century, the age of exploration had already redrawn the map of the world. But this was just the beginning. The next phase would see the rise of global empires, the exchange of goods, plants, and diseases, and the birth of what we now call globalization. Part 2. Empires, Exchanges, and Encounters. When sailors looked out over the endless blue horizon, they weren't just chasing wealth, they were chasing the unknown. Each sunrise at sea was both a promise and a warning. You may find a new world, or you may vanish beneath the waves. For many explorers, that risk was worth everything. And as their ships crossed new oceans, the entire world began to change forever. The discovery of new worlds. By the early 1500s, the results of European voyages were astonishing. Entire continents, previously unknown to Europe, appeared on maps. The Americas, the Pacific Islands, and even parts of Australia were now being explored. Each expedition brought back new stories of golden cities, strange animals, and unfamiliar peoples. One of the most dramatic examples was the voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor working for Spain. In 1519, he set out to find a westward route to Asia. His fleet of 5 ships sailed through violent storms, mutinies, and starvation before reaching what is now known as the Strait of Magellan, a narrow, treacherous passage at the southern tip of South America. When his crew finally entered the Pacific Ocean, they were stunned by its calmness. After months of chaos at sea, Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, peaceful sea. However, the journey was far from peaceful. Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, and only one ship, the Victoria, returned to Spain 3 years later. Out of 270 men, only 18 survived. Yet, they had achieved something no one else had. They had sailed around the entire world. That single voyage proved beyond any doubt that the Earth was round and connected by vast oceans. Humanity had, at last, seen the size of its own planet. The Columbian Exchange. The world transformed. Exploration didn't just change maps, it changed life itself. The Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, describes the massive transfer of plants, animals, goods, and diseases between the old and new worlds. Imagine Europe before potatoes, tomatoes, or chocolate. Before Columbus, none of these existed there. After his voyages, these crops spread rapidly, transforming European diets. Meanwhile, horses, pigs, and cattle, all brought from Europe, spread across the Americas, changing indigenous ways of life forever. But not all exchanges were positive. The arrival of Europeans also brought deadly diseases like smallpox and measles, which devastated Native American populations. Entire civilizations, such as the Aztec and Inca empires, were brought to their knees not only by swords and guns, but by invisible enemies their immune systems had never faced. Still, this new connection between continents also accelerated scientific knowledge. Botanists studied exotic plants, doctors experimented with unfamiliar herbs, and mapmakers redrew the boundaries of the world. For the first time, humanity began to see itself as part of a truly global system. The rise of colonial empires. Exploration soon turned into colonization, and colonization into empire. Spain built a vast empire across South and Central America, while Portugal controlled trade routes in Africa, India, and the East Indies. Later, Britain, France, and the Netherlands joined the race, founding colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Asia. These empires competed fiercely for control of trade and resources. Gold and silver from the Americas filled European treasuries, while spices and silk from Asia became symbols of power and prestige. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost. Millions of indigenous people were enslaved, displaced, or killed. The transatlantic slave trade began, forcing African men, women, and children to work on plantations in the Americas under brutal conditions. In European capitals, explorers were celebrated as heroes, their portraits hung in royal halls, their names written in history. Yet behind their triumphs lay human suffering on a massive scale. The age of exploration was, in truth, both an age of discovery and destruction. Life on board an explorer's ship. To understand this era, imagine the life of a sailor aboard a 16th century vessel. The deck creaked constantly under the pressure of the waves. The air smelled of salt, wood, and unwashed clothes. Rats crawled between barrels of dry biscuits and salted meat. The crew slept in hammocks, often soaked with seawater, dreaming of distant lands and fearing they'd never see home again. Storms could strike without warning. Lightning would split the sky, masts could break, and entire ships could disappear overnight. Many sailors believed in sea monsters, ghosts, or curses. Yet, amid fear and superstition, there was also wonder, the thrill of being the first to see a new coastline, a new sunrise, or an island untouched by human eyes. For some, this was enough to justify every danger. As one sailor wrote in his diary in 1520, "The sea takes what it wishes, but for those who dare, it also gives eternity." A world connected. By the mid-16th century, the outlines of the modern world were taking shape. Global trade networks, linked continents, ideas flowed faster, and cultures began to mix, sometimes peacefully, often violently. Goods like silver, sugar, coffee, and tobacco became part of everyday life across Europe and Asia. European powers grew rich, while other parts of the world were exploited and reshaped to serve their needs. This new global order brought not only wealth, but also a new worldview. The idea of progress, science, and exploration became deeply rooted in European thought. The Renaissance spirit of curiosity, the same that sent ships beyond the horizon, would soon evolve into the scientific revolution and the modern age. Part 3. Legacy of Discovery. By the late 1600s, the world was no longer a mystery, at least not in the way it had been. Maps had changed forever. Oceans once marked as blank spaces now carried names and routes. Continents were no longer distant rumors, but places connected through trade, culture, and shared stories. The age of exploration was over, but its legacy was only beginning. Mapping the world. Before the great voyages, maps were works of imagination as much as science. Sea monsters guarded the edges of the known world, and distant lands were drawn from myths or second-hand tales. After a century of exploration, this began to change. Sailors returned with detailed observations, and cartographers turned them into accurate maps. For the first time, humankind could see the world as one, a single, interconnected sphere of land and sea. The invention of new navigational tools, like the astrolabe, the compass, and later the chronometer, allowed captains to calculate their positions more precisely. Seafarers no longer sailed into the unknown. Blindly, they followed the careful work of those who came before. Each updated map represented not just geography, but courage, endurance, and human curiosity. The new age of science and curiosity. Exploration inspired a new way of thinking, one based on observation and evidence. The same spirit that had driven men across uncharted oceans now began to drive scientists to explore nature itself. Botanists studied plants from faraway lands. Astronomers compared the stars from both hemispheres. Geographers and mathematicians collaborated to measure the size and shape of the Earth with increasing accuracy. This was more than discovery, it was the beginning of a global exchange of knowledge. When explorers brought back samples of new plants, minerals, and animals, they also brought questions that challenged old beliefs. How could species be so different across continents? Why did the night sky look different in the southern hemisphere? What forces shaped mountains, rivers, and storms? These questions led to the foundations of modern science. Geography, biology, astronomy, and meteorology all grew from the seeds of exploration. The human side of discovery. Beyond science and trade, exploration changed the human imagination. For the first time in history, ordinary people could hear about lands across the ocean, told through journals, letters, and stories printed in early newspapers. The world suddenly felt larger, richer, and more mysterious. Tales of explorers became legends. Children dreamed of adventure. Poets wrote of distant horizons. And inventors began to see the Earth as a place full of potential rather than limits. One can imagine a quiet night in a European harbor around 1620. A sailor stands on the dock, watching lanterns flicker on the water. He has returned from a long voyage, carrying memories of coral reefs, star-filled skies, and lands of endless green. He may never travel again, but he knows something few others do: how wide and beautiful the world truly is. Such experiences shaped the way people saw themselves. Humanity was no longer confined to one continent or one sky. It had stepped into the universe as an explorer. The legacy of the great voyages. Today, we live in a world that those early navigators could barely imagine. A world where airplanes cross oceans in hours, and satellites map every mountain and river with precision. Yet, in many ways, we are still driven by the same spirit, to the desire to see beyond the horizon. The explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries expanded not only geography but also the boundaries of human potential. They showed that courage and curiosity could reshape the course of civilization. Ships that once carried spices and gold now carry ideas, art, and culture. The global connections they began centuries ago continue to define our modern world, from international trade and science to the shared fascination with travel and discovery. When astronauts look down at Earth from space, they see a single, shining globe, just as the cartographers of the Renaissance once dreamed of drawing. In that moment, the circle of exploration feels complete, a journey without end. The age of exploration ended, but exploration itself never did. Today, scientists dive into the deepest oceans, launch telescopes into space, and study planets billions of kilometers away. The technology has changed, but the emotion behind it remains the same. It's the same spark that burned in the hearts of Magellan, da Gama, and countless unnamed sailors, the belief that there is always more to learn, more to see, and more to understand. The sea is no longer the final frontier, but the human spirit, restless, curious, and fearless, continues its voyage through time, ever searching for the next horizon.